On today's episode, we talk about how economy is just a code word for the wealthy, what a noble and virtuous leader Nixon was, how capitalism must mean genocide and colonization, the infallible decision to mandate lower prices of food goods in Hungary, and lastly, how no profits are necessary in order for Wikipedia to exist or Minecraft buildings to be built. This is Cringe Posts. Hello and welcome to this episode of the Cringe Post podcast, the show where we cull through our feeds, we find the cringiest takes we can find, and then we talk about them, what the underlying assumptions are, why they're wrong, and try to take a laugh when we get a chance to. If you enjoy this show or are having a good time, we would encourage a comment, a like, a share, a subscription, all those great things. We are growing and we want to continue that. So thanks so much for doing that, and thanks for listening all of last year and into this next year. Before we dunk on other people, though, myself and my co-host Britt, we like to make fun of our own posts. So we're going to turn to one of our own first self-cringe posts before we get into dunking on other people. But as a new thing I want to plug before we get into that is now on our website, cringepost.com. If you are listening in an audio version only and you're not seeing any visuals, there is going to be a visual accompaniment so that if you're just listening on Spotify or Apple Music or whatever, wherever you're getting your podcasts, you can go to cringepost.com and see the cringes as well if you want to look at them for any pictures or just to have a visual representation of the cringes. So go check those out at cringeposts.com. So that first self-cringe comes from Britt in December of 2008. So this one's a pretty old one. This reads, Adam Young equals quite possibly the most creative musician out there, ... And for those who are not familiar, Adam Young is in fact Owl City. Owl City is his solo venture. He's the one responsible for, such wonderful hits as Fireflies and Hello Seattle, which are perhaps the most creative songs ever. I mean,
yeah.
I remember actually in college, what was really funny is I don't love Owl City. Like, it's not really my thing. I don't mind it. I'm not a hater, though. But I remember actually at one point, my friend Nico and I were in a debate, and Britt was like mediating between us because my friend Nico was just tearing Adam Young a new one. He was saying like I hate the way that he manipulates his voice to make it sound like he's talking like this. And I was saying, well, I'm like, there's no way you could possibly know that he's that's probably just how he sings. Like, what are you talking about? And I remember Britt was laughing. You're like, like my left half of my brain and my left half of my brain understand each of your guys' arguments. I don't know.
I don't remember that. That's crazy. You remember that?
Yeah, I remember. It was really funny.
Man, so 2008, like I was just kind of coming into my teenage years and everything, and I was a piano player and stuff. And I actually remember on MySpace, I messaged Owl City. I was asking him some questions about synthesizers and stuff, and he replied to me. And so I was like, "This is sick and amazing."
Cool. Yeah.
And so that's pretty cool. But like, I was like, "Oh, he's so good," and like he makes this techno music, and I'm a sheltered homeschool kid that only ever listened to Newsboys, and so this is like the first like other type of music I've ever heard, and so I was like, "Wow, this is so creative," because I'd never been experienced anything else. It's truly like, so I was so myopic in my taste that I was like, this thing that everyone else does must be so creative. Obviously, I still kind of like Owl City, like I think a lot of his melodic choices and stuff are pretty cool, and he really did innovate a lot of cool stuff. But he's not the most creative musician out there.
Well, to be fair, you didn't say he was. You said quite possibly. So you left room for interpretation. It's funny that you're saying that like you're a sheltered homeschooler, and so your branch out was to Owl City, which is so funny because I feel like all of my homeschooled friends is where I heard Owl City from at first.
Yes.
So it's like, oh, look what I discovered, and it's like, yeah, that's a very homeschooled thing to like. But
yes,
I feel like the first branch out of music that you find is always really funny because you grow up at first listening to what your dad listens to, kind of that in my experience, that's a lot of people's, was our experience, and then you find something that you like from your dad's stuff, which for me and my brother for years was like the only thing we'd listen to was Weird Al.
Oh, no way.
Yeah, so like through I don't know, like 2004 or 5, like basically only knew Weird Al, which is how I know a lot of pop and like popular music in general is just through Weird Al parodies or references. And then in 2005, we had a German exchange student come over and he showed us the All American Rejects, and it was all sort of I don't know, alternative rock into pop punk, Good Charlotte, and Panic at the Disco and stuff. So it's kind of funny. But eventually, Owl City came along, and I was a fierce enemy at first, and then I started to like it a lot, and then I was very bullish, and now I'm just sort of middling. But I will say he's creative, but not the most creative.
He's not the most. Yeah. It was funny, man. Like you were saying, like, it's like the first music you enjoy is like the stuff your parents listen to. And then you branch out, and it was Owl City for me. And then this hardcore band called Under Oath. Like those two bands were the ones that I heard like first, like venture out to like non-parent music, and kind of very much different on the scales. Under Oath is significantly more creative, I think, than Adam Young. They're very cool, but I don't know. I guess in this season, I was thinking that Owl City was the Beethoven, a modern day Beethoven.
Well, if you just write lyrics that are somewhat incoherent and random, I think that makes you by default more creative, right?
Yes, yeah.
Okie dokie. Well, we'll move to our first cringe post. This one is from Twitter and reads, quote, "Economy," unquote, "is code for the wealthy. When the economy is doing well, that means the wealthy are getting even richer. When the economy is doing poorly, that means the wealthy are not getting quite as rich. Meanwhile, life continues to get more difficult for the rest of us." This one, I sympathize a little bit, only in the sense that I can see how someone who is bought into the media facade of what life is and what's going on, and they're hearing people like Hassan online or the Young Turks or what have you, I can understand how they think life would get more difficult for the rest of you, and that the economy is this code word. That being said, don't say that with certainty, in fact, because that's in fact not true, right? The economy, to reference another episode, the economy is kind of like the society. We live in an economy. We live in a society, and we live in an economy. The economy is just people doing things and creating things and value and exchange going on. So to say that the economy is code for the wealthy, it's if anything, if you're going to grant them, economy might be code more for the productive, not necessarily the wealthy. And let's be real. When the economy is doing well, the wealthy do get richer, and a lot of that comes from just assets being grown and people who have invested a lot and risked a lot getting payback for those kinds of things. Getting what they've put in returned to them. And when the economy is not doing so poorly and they're still getting rich, sometimes that's because of smart financial decisions with savings and with opportunities to help people in hard times. And then a lot of it is the government bailing out really big companies through stealing your money through force and through taxes, and then giving those in subsidies to big companies because they're too big to fail and what have you. So I understand this feeling of like we're getting screwed while the rich people pay nothing. But honestly, the economy doing well is good for everyone, right? The rising tide lifts all boats, per se.
Yeah, when I was kind of looking through these, I struggled for a minute because like you and I don't think we would ever say in the past maybe 30, 40, 50 years we've had a healthy economy, right? Like it's all been unhealthy. But if we strip that away and we just kind of look at it from the layman's terms, like are we doing better and are there a lot of jobs and stuff? We've had stretches of a good quote unquote economy. And this person to me reeks of someone who has never participated in the economy. Specifically, like I used to work in the construction industry, right? And from a period from about 2017 to 2019, we had what the layman would say, not what you and I would say, but what the layman would say is like a good, great, really fast economy. And, I worked with hundreds of different skilled tradespeople. I worked with hundreds of different types of businesses that supplied supplies or building buildings or managing properties or businesses supplying any types of goods or services. And they were all saying, wow, this economy is so amazing. And these are normal people, right? They're pulling out of their business or they're working a normal job and they're pulling, the median income, $50,000 to $80,000 a year, right? Salary. So they're doing pretty good, but they're like, hey, like this is awesome. We can continue expanding our business. Everything's really great. And the only people during that time that would say, that the economy wasn't good is someone that is not participating in it, right? Because the economy sucks if you're not producing anything, no matter what time and period you're in, because if you're not producing things, you're not making money and you're not getting better. And the other thing, I mean, we've hammered this almost every time one of these economic illiterate cringe takes comes out, but it's like, life becoming more difficult for you. Like, when has life become more difficult for you in terms of like your standard of living, right? Like, I love looking at, so I have Old Spice body wash in my shower, and on the back it has this catch line, and I've mentioned it here before, but it says, "You smell better than every king that has ever existed, in history, when you put this on." And they're right, right? Like, my standard of living, my lifespan, my quality of life, the fact that I have air conditioning, the fact that I can go to the sink and turn on water and get a cool cup of water, is so much better than any king, from 1,000 years ago, right? That might have had thousands or hundreds of thousands of subjects. And so these people, that post these things, it's kind of like that symptom to me. It's just like these people are, they're not participating, and because they're not participating in the economy, they have to say, well, this just all sucks. Like, it sucks, and that's why I'm not participating.
It's when you were mentioning the start of it, which is when does the standard of living drop for you? And it really doesn't. The most notable time that it will drop for someone is when they lose a job, right? That's or have to move to an area with higher cost of living. And what's funny? In a healthy economy, those kinds of things are mitigated a little bit, in a market where people are, like you were saying, when a construction business is able to start hiring more and expand and create new jobs, that means that someone who lost their job has new opportunities when businesses expand and hire more people. So your shift in the life getting more difficult for you part, if it's due to something like a job loss, that gets mitigated by a good economy. Irrespective of the wealthy, how they're doing, when they have, when businesses can grow, they will. And then the other, so you've got, jobs there. And then the other thing is cost of living. Like, maybe you move to a more expensive state or something like that. And guess what else helps cost of living go down? A healthy economy. When you invest in new technologies that help products be produced for cheaper and more widely available, and you have more competition, more businesses, rising up and offering competing services, then prices go down. And so even if you have the same dollar amount, then you get more for your dollar, as the general trend with capitalism has been historically. And it's why capitalism and free trade have managed to raise the standard of living globally by something like 80% in the last 200 years. I don't remember the exact stats, but it's something crazy like that. So yeah, I mean, again, I sympathize a little bit with this person if they just buy what they're being told. But I mean, that doesn't excuse that it's a cringe post, like it's it's sort of confidently wrong,
Well, I mean, it's like the Owl City post. I only knew Owl City existed, so
right,
you can't really,
right.
I mean, it's understandable. I would only think that was the most creative thing out there. If this person's only getting their news or their information from the Young Turks or wherever, where it's like the economy's bad, and because there's so many of these wealthy people, you're worse and worse off and struggling. It's like, yeah, I get it. So it's like, go get out there and work, and then you won't have time to listen to the Young Turks, and and you'll be way better off.
Well, and yeah, I mean, that's to be fair, that's kind of the thing, is like, when people are productive in general, they are happier too. And I think just in general, one of the things in cringe posts that we hit a lot is that there's a lot of people who post when they have time on their hands and are maybe more angry than they need to be.
Yeah.
But also the media feeds off of negative stories anyway. So saying things like why you should be mad at the wealthy is much more, I don't know, it moves a lot more units than saying, here's why our economy is actually unstable. Because the economy being unstable, it might be negative, but it doesn't give you a scapegoat necessarily to pin it on, unless I guess they accurately wanted to, talk about the politicians or whatever. But they don't want to do that. They don't want to upset their betters. They don't want to forego a chance to interview some senator or something like that, So it is what it is. But I think ultimately this person is probably just suffering from a very closed group of information, of an echo chamber of sorts, that's telling them you're doing worse and it's the rich people's fault, and that's the end of the story. And they don't really understand what an economy means for them as a everyday person. Okie dokie, we'll move to our next cringe post, and this one comes from Representative Anthony Sabatini, I believe. I could be mispronouncing that. And just for context, he is a very populist pro-Trump Republican, I believe in New York, if I'm not mistaken. And so he's sort of the persuasion of like Matt Gaetz or Marjorie Taylor Greene, Lauren Boebert, that kind, right? Very, very pro-Trump, very wanting, and you know, not totally off the mark in many ways, sort of like this new populist anti-war sentiment and, you know, sort of skeptical of the CIA in many cases. And yet he comes with this really bad take. He posts on January 9, "Happy birthday to Richard Nixon, a great American leader with a profound understanding of the enemies of freedom that is sorely lacking in the party today. His message of law and order, peace and prosperity is essential, now more than ever." And it's like, dude, if you wanted to espouse the good things about Nixon, it's a lot shorter to list out those things than to praise a very, very failed and flawed vessel for those things. At best, and there's a lot of, I've done some reading on both perspectives of Nixon in China, on like the idea that he would, not antagonize China, but then on the other hand, he would praise the Chinese dictator. And, there's back and forth on that or whatever. So maybe foreign policy, you could make the argument that he was a peacemaker versus sort of going to war. You could make that claim, I suppose. And maybe that's what he's trying to do. But if you look at anything else that this guy did, they are all things that incepted the problems that we have today that you, Anthony Sabatini, are complaining about. For instance, this guy's very against the prosecution of the January 6th protesters. Well, what authority are these guys being tried under but sort of this wing of like anti-domestic terrorism and this sort of internal FBI, CIA? Oh, guess who sort of empowered those things to, I don't know, have a foothold in the American system? Richard Nixon. You're against a lot of red tape and regulation. Guess who created the EPA? Richard Nixon. And then to say law and order, after we've come out of, the Black Lives Matter protests where the police stood down while cities burned, I don't think the government's a good arbiter for law and order and the police state. I think it's only ever going to be used against you because you are an enemy of the state.
Yeah, one of my favorite stories that my dad tells me about kind of his awakening towards like how crooked most presidents are and most administrations are was when a bunch of these tapes were released and you had Henry Kissinger saying like, oh, well, maybe we should just prolong the Vietnam War because it's good for elections.
Exactly.
And it's like, okay, so Nixon had such a profound understanding of the enemies of freedom that he surrounded himself with people like Henry Kissinger. And not to mention, him taking us off the gold standard and all that stuff. And
right.
It's what's a bummer about a lot of Republicans. And, I remember you telling me about our former classmate at NU who described herself as a libertarian and then also simultaneously said, oh, my favorite president was Richard Nixon. And the problem, and you and I are guilty of this, right? In our past cringes, is that it's like we kind of confuse the public persona or personality that is put out there of like toughness and like traditional or whatever with like, oh, that's a good president. And then you kind of, because we didn't like research whether or not like, hey, like, yeah, they prolonged a war to try and stay in office, or that was on the table, right? Or all these different things, or took us off the Federal Reserve. Like we don't factor that in because we're not really, we haven't woken up to like, hey, that's important, right? So a lot of Republicans make that mistake. I think they made that mistake with Trump. I think they're making that mistake with lots of different politicians. Like, oh, well, he's just tough, when it's like, no, like look at his actions, right? Like, like he kept saying he was tough and build the wall and all this stuff, and then he didn't do it. Whether or not you or I agree or disagree on whether that should have been built or even been part of it, it's like he said he was going to do something and played tough, and then he didn't do it. And I think a lot of Republicans kind of look back on Nixon as that, right? And that's That's unfortunate, right? And that's kind of that's one of the whole points of cringe posts, right? Is to take this history that continually gets revised to suit the current narrative and like blow it apart and reveal why it is actually this isn't actually the way you think it is.
Yeah, I was gonna say the funny thing is I feel like on all of the recent conservative sort of populist praises of Richard Nixon, the most common thing I see is people saying, "Well, I wish he hadn't taken us off the gold standard," which I'm like, oh. We're making a little bit of progress then. Even if that's just kind of a talking line, it's kind of like the anti-war thing. But unfortunately, just as you point out with Vietnam, it's very, very vapid in the grand scheme of things where they say they're anti-war and then they praise the president who had our, Vietnam involvement in prolonging and stuff. And so it is all about these tough guy personas. I mean, even like someone like Reagan, who I think he maybe for better then I generally am willing to give credit to a president, had talked tough foreign policy, but was less, aggressive than he talked. Not that he was totally anti-war, but there were a lot of reports about him defying his administration, wanting him to, not take meetings with the Soviet Union and stuff like that, and Reagan wanting, no, I want to go in and negotiate for peace, those kinds of things. So you give him credit there, and then on the other hand, so he talks tough and isn't exactly that that hawkish, which is maybe a good thing, and then he talks a good small government game, and then expands the spending on the government and only doesn't spend more on domestic, and you're like, okay, so really your persona has almost nothing to do with what you're actually going to do. And so we do need to look at the track record. So it's like, let's look at Nixon's track record. We look at a prolonged Vietnam War. We look off the gold standard. We see increased, domestic spying through, the FBI, CIA military apparatus that's targeting Americans in many cases, creating big government bureaucratic organizations like the EPA. And you're like, what is there to admire from a conservative? Well, I guess we can conserve his legacy. That's just about it.
That's kind of the story of every president. Like, and that's what I hope people realize is like, if I went back and watched some debate footage of Bush, in the 2000 election, and it's like, wow, like this guy's saying all the right stuff. He seems kind of pretty anti-war, anti-foreign intervention, and it's like, ooh, one of the biggest like, he's the one that got us into all these different crazy things, right? And then you have Obama, right? All this really, really good talk, and then I think it was that I can't remember, was it WikiLeaks that released like he had the Citibank emailed him like, hey, this is going to be your cabinet, and it's basically all the same people, right? From the Bush era, and coincidentally, right, like it's basically continuation of the Bush era policies. And it's like, oh, and then it continues under Trump and continues under Biden. It's like these guys are all the same. They all have the same incentives, right, to do bad actions that enrich a minority of people at the expense of American lives and wealth. And and this is what I hope people realize is like there's basically no good presidents out there, right? And at least in modern day, in the past 150 years, there's not been a good president that hasn't done something that hasn't grown the size of government. If you view growing the size of government as evil, then obviously they're evil.
Well, okay, hold on. Don't be so rude to my boy Calvin Coolidge.
Okay, you're right. He's not. He's okay.
He's not perfect. He's not perfect. He definitely had some entanglements in South America that he should not have been in. But overall, peacetime president, other than some minute military action, which was bad and unfortunate, should be scolded.
You're right. Okay. He's good. And then maybe before him, maybe you get to Jefferson and it's all right. Jefferson's first term and it's all right.
Yeah, Jefferson's first term, Grover Cleveland's first term, but second term presidencies often are bad, and that's a really interesting trend too to notice. And of course,
is weird.
Your third term is even worse. Just ask FDR, the only one to have a third term. Anyway, we'll move on. All right, our next tweet reads, capitalism began in England around the 16th century. They immediately went on to colonize half the planet in search of new markets, committed multiple genocides, traded slaves, and engaged in constant war. In school, we learned about how communism is evil because of a famine. Okay. So this is almost like you could almost take this from a Noam Chomsky book. I think I've I may have remarked this on the show. I know I've at least said it before to anyone who will hear the rantings and ravings of myself. But I tried to I was listening to one of Noam Chomsky's books on tape, just through an audiobook. And I don't remember what it's called. It was something with the media in the title. About 50 of his books have media involved. But anyway, he's talking about capitalism, and he starts describing colonialism and this sort of world hegemonic attitude of invading for markets and these kinds of things. And I was getting really mad because I'm like, well, no, you're conflating that capitalism necessitates this, conquest into foreign intervention. And that's not a necessity. Now, can it be an incentive? Absolutely it can, and I don't think that that's a great thing. But the problem is that communism similarly has that conquest, and not only do they have that conquest outwards, they have the conquest inwards, where they murder their own people, they starve their own populations, either on purpose or because of a lack of ability to produce. So human nature is evil, and governments in general are evil, and this kind of violence and this kind of colonialization in general, it's not a new thing. You can't just say capitalism exists, so does colonialism. I don't know, bro. England did them both. That must mean that capitalism creates these genocides. And it's like, okay, what about Rome? Was Rome capitalist? Not by any. That's a pretty state-run economy, as far as I'm aware. I'm pretty sure they conquered a little bit more. And then to just dismiss communism as a famine, that shows that you did learn about that in public school. I think that did reveal that.
Yes. It's I think there's multiple ways to kind of go at this one. So first, like colonialism is not a feature of capitalism, but mass death and genocide is a feature of communism, right? Because communism, the central premise is centrally planned economies and uniform obedience to authority. And if people aren't going to obey, how do you make sure you enforce it? Well, you've got the gulags, you've got all these different things that we have pretty well documented, right? The other aspect of it too, so let's just take that aside. Like colonialism and capitalism they don't have to be together. There's been plenty of societies that were pretty capitalistic without colonialism in them. But let's say, even if they were, right? Like, let's look at how the world overall standard of living since 1500, and let's look at the overall world population since 1500. You don't really see it explosive in growth until you see humans starting to learn how to work together and specialize in their fields. And yeah, we don't like the slave trade. We don't like, and I would say that that's not part of capitalism, like I said earlier, because it's not humans working together. That is someone encroaching on someone else and using violence to force them to do something. Like I said, a very big feature of communism. It's essential for that to work. But yeah, you pull up Google world population chart, and it's once we started having cooperation and specialization and profit motive, which we'll get to here in a moment with another cringe post, you see an explosion in standards of living, you see an explosion in population growth. Some leftists would say that's a bad thing, right? Specifically, communist China doesn't really like growth in population or anything like that. So it would be hard. It's very hard to argue that we are not better off today than we were in 1500. I don't think you could find any reasonable person to make that argument and make it convincingly. Likewise, like you were saying, this person obviously in public school, learned nothing, right? And that's to be expected.
Yeah, it's when you're talking about the slave trade, it's like, okay, you could argue that capitalism maybe created the slave trade. The interesting thing is communism is the slave trade. That's everyone is the slaves except for the government, And in capitalism, you have the voluntary efforts of people to ban the slave trade and to prohibit the slave trade. That was a feature of Western capitalist countries. Again, capitalist to whatever degree you want, with government and state influence, but nevertheless. So I don't know, the idea that capitalism, it's like, I don't know, you look at the course of human history and you see a lot of constants. You see that slaves have been a feature of sort of the global populations in almost every subsector that you look at where there are competing tribes of any kind. Tribes go to war and they take slaves. That's kind of just the norm of human civilization up to a certain point, right? So it's not like that was invented by capitalism. You look at war, that was very obviously not invented by capitalism. You have so much war going on, and like you said, capitalism involves voluntary agreement, voluntary exchange, sort of this free market idea that if you have something I want and I have something you want, we exchange, we agree, and we're both better off for it. That's capitalism, right? Has nothing to do with war and taking by force. So war, not something that's existed with capitalism either. Colonization, again, with war, with slaves, not a thing that existed or a thing that existed predating any sort of idea of capitalism. And so these things sort of like exist in history. They still go on today. It doesn't mean that it's a feature of capitalism. It means it's a feature of human nature. And then you look at what has started when capitalism was introduced, and it's this incredible standard of living rise that you were talking about. That's what correlates. Now, you're going to have sort of the midwits coming in saying things like, well, correlation doesn't equal causation. It's like, yeah, true. That's not by a literal, I can prove this to you. But when you have, a couple hundred years of history and an increased rise and a increased uptake of capitalism as the primary motivator of an economic system for these countries, it's a pretty safe bet to say that the raising of standard of livings for people probably has something to do with the economic system that they're living in, since standard of living and economics kind of are connected a little bit.
Totally agree.
Okay, we're going to go to another bad economic take here. This one comes from Sohrab, Ahmari, who is a writer for, he's the New York Post op-ed editor, and he contributes to some other more conservative publications. Like I think he does stuff for the Wall Street Journal and things like that. He's a right-wing, populist. Maybe he wouldn't describe himself that way. Anyway, so the first tweet is a sort of a news announcement saying, breaking, PM Orbán announces that the Hungarian government rolling back the price of flour, milk, sugar, sunflower oil, pork leg, and chicken breast from this February 1st to the next to the level they were at on October 15, 2021. And Sohrab quote retweets this with the line, whiny voice. But what would Milton Friedman say? The party of the state for the win.
Oh, no.
And what's funny is Sohrab Ahmari has actually already been featured in Cringe Posts, if you don't recall. We actually had a Reason magazine editor calling him out for wanting to force people to have to suppress free speech. And then I think that was when we actually dunked on Michael Knowles, who had the compelled speech line or whatever, you will be punished or whatever. But that was actually originating from a bad take from Sohrab Ahmari about compelled speech. And here he is again advocating for compelled prices. Oh boy, it's not just the leftists who are bad on economics, it's the right as well.
Yeah, it's funny. I forgot about that take because immediately when I saw this, I was like, "Ooh, this is like Michael Knowles' brand of conservatism." Like it's very much like I know what is right, and we must take power and make what is right happen without any regard towards the principle. It's a very the means justify or the ends justify the means sort of approach, without any regard to the fact that like maybe you won't be the person in charge of the means, at some point. Yeah, man, this is, I guess when you look at conservatives, this is kind of the hallmark bad economic take that they usually have. It's very protectionist. Like we need to have tariffs and we need to, like when Obama did it. I know he's not conservative, but when Obama, spent $900,000 per tire job to keep the tire, like I think it was like 1,000 tire jobs or something like that here in the United States. And it's like, wow, like you spent almost $1 million to keep a job that pays, a median salary of about $65,000 here in the States. That seems like a good trade, dude. But like conservatives will put that as a win because they're very much like, well, like it doesn't matter if it makes economic sense. Like it needs to make moral sense, and that's where it kind of stems from, which is nice in a way because it's like, okay, hey, like if we can convince them on a moral level that like this is wrong, then you can kind of win the argument and actually convert someone in that way. But like I was saying, the problem with this is it's like all this power and all these things that the same power that the Hungarian government is going to use to control price floors is the same power that they're going to use for vaccine mandates or for any other bad policy that these conservatives don't want to have in place. And they have no regard for like the implications and the potential consequences of this power being used. And they would say, well, power exists, and so we might as well yield it. But it's like, well, maybe we should change that paradigm.
One of my favorite replies to this tweet was someone saying, something along the lines of, he would probably, the question being, what would Milton Friedman say, asked sarcastically, and then he replied, he would probably say that the unintended consequences of here will be more problematic than the immediate, fix. And that's the thing that I think is it's very human to not see the long-term effects and the unintended consequences of something, right? It's much harder to imagine the unknown and the undone than it is to imagine the either done before or immediately what's in front of you. So in the same way that, a lot of people that I thought should have known better were, happy when they got their $1,200 stimulus check from the COVID relief things. It's like, okay, one, the unintended consequences of this alone, is going to be bad in terms of inflation. You can't just generate value out of nowhere. This is, a tax that ultimately you're going to pay for. And then, of course, all the additional stuff that was in that bill, that was obviously bad. But so it's like, but people are, but $1,200 right now for me, I will take this. I like that. I like having this instant gratification of $1,200. And similarly, I'm sure a lot of people like Sorab and people in Hungary are like, I like that my pork leg is going down like the equivalent of, $3 or something like that. But it's like, the problem is that the unintended consequences and all the economic factors that we talk about, they have real world impacts. One thing that Dave Smith says that I like is that libertarian theory is pointless if it doesn't impact the real world. If all we're doing is talking about ideas and theories in sort of this ephemeral way, like, who cares? I only care about these things as far as they matter in the real world. And so it's like the reason why, something that Milton Friedman would say, and Milton Friedman's not even like the hallmark of libertarianism.
No.
But even still, he's way more on the money, like by a solar system than this guy. And the whole point of him saying things like, this would have unintended consequences if he were around to say that, is the fact that it would, and those unintended consequences will hurt the people it's supposed to help, because you don't have the people who are producing the flour, the milk, the sugar, the sunflower oil, etc. They don't have as much profit to grow their operations. They don't have as much incentive to produce these things to create a more bountiful supply for people. You're trying to skip the part of the price reduction where the actual value is created. The reason why prices drop is when either supply, demand wanes or supply increases. And without the supply increase or the demand waning, what you're going to end up with is short on supplies and high on demand, and then you get a shortage. That's literally why centrally planned economies don't work in communism or in populist rightist, conservatism, I guess, if that's what you call this. So yeah, so it's frustrating when he's sort of dunking on this idea, like, what would Milton Friedman say? Like, oh no, your economic theory's in the wake of helping real people. It's like, this doesn't actually help real people. Do you think it helps people more to have more expensive, pork leg, or the inability to buy pork leg?
Yeah, people confuse like economic theory with like economic like policy, right? Economic theory, all you're trying to do is explain what is currently happening in a way that can predict future outcomes based on whatever actions are taken, today or tomorrow or whenever. And Bob Murphy, you and I are both big fans, has this great example of like price signals, right? Because I think a lot of people would be asking, well, what is the problem, right? What's the unintended consequence of keeping prices low? Well, prices signal to suppliers and to anyone who uses pork legs or whatever, or materials, like, hey, you need to start doing something different, right? And a good example of this is like, let's say there's 3 copper mines in the world, right? And at 2 of the copper mines, they cave in, right? So there's no more copper, right? And so there's literally thousands of companies that use copper to build their products, and because there's so much demand for copper now and there's not enough supply, copper prices go up, right? And so now these companies that need copper, the companies that don't need copper as much, or it's not as critical to their product, they're going to start finding alternatives, right, to substitute for that copper. Whereas the companies that absolutely need copper are going to pay the additional price. No one needs to understand that or know that a mine collapsed, in Africa or Brazil or somewhere, for them to make the changes. They don't need to know all the intricacies of the supply chain. They just need to see, oh, prices went up and my customer base will not pay this much, or maybe they will pay this much, and then they can adapt accordingly. When you ruin that price signal, people are left blind. They're literally in the dark. They're not able to make decisions the way that they normally would. And because of that, the really well-oiled, efficient system that makes sure that goods and services are produced at the most amount of quantity at lowest price gets disrupted. And so we don't know, like you were saying, we have no idea how this price floor or price ceiling is going to affect the market. But I guarantee you, it's going to result in some sort of disparate outcome that is absurd. I've talked about this example before, but I remember talking to this fella in France who had lived through some of the Soviet Union stuff, and he's like, yeah, like there's this one time where the Soviet Union, for whatever reason, they mandated like what type of produce we could grow, and he's like, so eventually, like there's this one winter where all we had was tomatoes, right? Because they were taxing and taking and placing disincentives on growing potatoes or corn or anything like that, and so everyone grew tomatoes, right? Because they're going to adapt in some way to this artificial enforcement. And that's kind of like the absurd outcomes that happen when you have one person or a group of people or government that can't understand every variable trying to make decisions and force outcomes.
Absolutely. The last example I will throw in is maybe a little bit closer to home for some people here, which is if you look at there's sort of this global chip shortage going on, right? Because the demand for video cards and chips and things like that has skyrocketed, and so you have this global shortage. And so one specific way that this has seen sort of in a consumer effect is the availability of video game graphics cards for your computer. It's you look at for like an NVIDIA graphics card that at the standard retail rate, and they're all sold out. And so right now it's like you go online and you want to buy a GTX 3060, you're going to pay like $1,000 from some reseller. Someone who's got one is like, hey, I don't need this one. I'm going to pay. If you want it, you can pay for it. And people think, oh, that's terrible. Like, look at all these people reselling at such a high price or whatever. But the reality of that is that if I absolutely needed a new graphics card because of some project I was working on, I could gather the capital and buy one, because it would, rather than me being sort of casually saving up for one and being like, I'll upgrade my computer, it's about time now. I you know what? I don't need that right now. I will wait for the supply to increase. So someone like me, it's like that increased price, not worth it, versus like a manufacturer who, their entire business model is selling pre-built gaming computers. Well, that graphics card is a huge deal for them, because without that key component, they can't sell a pre-made gaming computer, right? So they're going to be able to access that and pay a higher premium, not make as much return, but the availability is still there for them. And then they have to upmark the cost, but they can get a hold of that thing. And it literally prevents people like me who want one but don't need it in the current moment. I can hold on a little bit longer, and you create an availability where a shortage exists. And so
for who really needs it.
Exactly. So it's like if the government came in and mandated and said, you cannot sell your graphics cards for more than 10% the listed value, guess what? I would probably go and buy one for, 10% more. And then guess what? You have no availability to get graphics card except at the very rate that they're making them. And at that point, then who gets to decide who buys them?
That's a fantastic example. And I'm sorry, I'm going to tag one more on to it. I think it's really relevant. So like this past about a week and a half ago, I got COVID, right? And I was thinking, okay, like I'm not vaccinated and I have a little bit of asthma, so I want to do whatever I can to like make myself have the best odds. Like I don't know what I don't know, right? So I was looking into like, okay, what kind of monoclonal antibody treatment could I get potentially, or what treatments exist? And there were two options, right? There is, I could have gone to the government and tried to find some monoclonal antibody treatment. I probably would have to drive down to Portland because they only literally had only 54 doses available here in Seattle through like the normal hospitals. Or I could have paid $10,000 to this private party that would come to my house and inject it into me. And because I'm young, I'm under the age of 30, I'm pretty much healthy with the exception of the little asthma thing. I was like, I think I'll pass on paying $10,000 to get injected with this stuff because I'm like 99.99% sure I'm going to survive this. The thing is, it's like if I wasn't sure, if I was like on death's doorstep and there was a shortage of monoclonal antibodies because there's only 54 doses, I would figure out how to get $10,000 to go get that injection. And I'd be really thankful that someone, like an alternate me, right, wasn't able to go get that treatment when they didn't really need it, right? Because I weighed the price of that treatment versus what I thought I actually needed. And I was like, I don't need it. I don't need to spend 10 grand on this thing. And that's the beauty of, a lot of these people talk about like, well, we need to each according to their need, right? The very Marxist thing. It's like, well, if you really want that to happen, you have to have price signals because without price signals, people that don't need things are going to buy things. And people that do need things aren't going to be able to get them.
That's exactly right. And so I'm sorry, Sorab, but I can't agree with your bad take here. I don't find that there will probably be anything we agree on because I think he's that exact kind of conservative who
It's a bummer.
is wrong about everything. Okay. And for our last cringe post, this one's a little bit more visual. So once more, I'm going to plug that cringeposts.com guide for any of you audio listeners just to see all the images. In this cringe post, we have, without a profit motive, no one would be productive. And then 4 images are shown to sort of debunk this idea. Wikipedia editors creating Wikipedia. Minecraft players creating these massive structures and temples and buildings. Open source coders creating a lot of freeware projects. Volunteer firefighters putting out fire building. Now, I think there's multiple ways to talk about this one, but the way that the first thing at least that struck me was like, wait a minute, this to me seems like a really great argument in favor of Ancapistan. Because the what seems to me is that it's like you don't make a profit motive for its own sake. It's more that when you see a need and you can get a profit, you will, and then if you see a project that you want done and there's not necessarily a profit motive, you'll still do that thing if the incentive is right? Like the profit doesn't always equal a dollar amount. For a lot of people, like for instance, a Minecraft player creating something, the profit for them is the joy that they get out of building something and the experience doing that. Maybe it's doing it with friends. Maybe it's just like constructing something to be proud of. I don't paint a painting, a watercolor with my wife because I'm going to sell that painting and make profit. I'm do it because I want to spend time. And that to me is the profit, right? But the idea is that, like, without this profit motive, no one would be productive. Well, the profit doesn't specifically always have to be dollar in that sense. The idea is there's always an incentive to do something. And so it's like you're just demonstrating a lot of ways in which people worry about things that the government takes care of. And they're like, well, look, people do a lot of things voluntarily anyway. And so it's like, if we didn't have government-run fire departments, then yeah, I probably would sign up to be on my neighborhood's volunteer firefighter department because for me, the profit is making sure my home is watched and on safe and not burnt down. Thank you for helping my Ancapistan argument post. Accidentally based.
Yeah, I was thinking a lot about this because you're right. There's a lot of ways to tackle it. I think the first one that I want to go through is let's replace profit motive with like making food, right? Without making food, without an incentive to make food, no one would be productive. Like that's absurd, right? But the reality is profit motive is making sure something can exist, right? You wouldn't have Minecraft players unless Minecraft made a profit. You wouldn't have Wikipedia unless it made a profit. Yes, I know it's a non-profit organization, but it takes in more money than it gives out because if it didn't do that, it wouldn't exist. A funny thing, because I come from the tech space, most open source platforms and open source code libraries are actually owned by a for-profit business. And the reason they have an open source code thing is because it takes a lot of people to keep up a code library. And so the best way to do that is like, hey, I'm going to give you access to look at all this different code. You get the ability to look at it and adapt it how you want, but you're also going to help maintain it. So they outsource that and they reduce their costs that way. And then obviously, like, okay, if you had a volunteer firefighter, if they weren't able to make a profit in some other day job, the reason it's called a volunteer is because you don't need to be paid to do it, right? You wouldn't have people volunteering to be a firefighter if they weren't making money someplace else to help them and their families survive. And so, that's one aspect of it. And then two, like, there's this weird thing that, and I think it has to do with like the Marxist and leftist view of like what value is, like the definition of value, because they say productive. And it's like, well, like in order for society to exist, like there needs to be certain types of things made. Like you have to purify water, you have to make food and all this stuff. Building a full-scale replication of the Skyrim map in Minecraft is productive. You did a lot of stuff and a lot of work, but you didn't create a lot of value, right? Like if I told you to go stack a bunch of bricks, on one side of my property or something like that, and then I dropped, an anvil on it and it cracked all the bricks. It's like, well, there's no value created. Like it was destroyed. Yeah, you did a lot of work, but nothing actually occurred. And so and that's kind of like, I think the core misunderstanding for a lot of leftists, because they're like, well, we should just be able to make art and stuff. It's like, no, like there's a base level of resources that need to be created for there to be other things that happen, for volunteer firefighters to exist or Wikipedia editors to have a couple hours every night to edit articles.
Right. And I like what you were saying about, Minecraft wouldn't exist, or Minecraft, recreations wouldn't exist without Minecraft getting a profit and stuff like that. And it's like, then with all of these things, well, at least with 3 of the 4, take a step back. So, Minecraft recreations wouldn't exist without Minecraft profit. Minecraft profit wouldn't exist without coding fundamentals being discovered and existing. Coding fundamentals wouldn't exist without the computer. The computer wouldn't exist without electricity. Electricity wouldn't exist without innovators, looking out and finding ways to hook up power lines. So you have all these things in society that have to come first. You can't just expect things to be done for free in a vacuum. It's like there's this hierarchy, like you're talking about, of things that need to exist and that you need, and almost all of those things are created with a profit motive. And so it's like,
they have to
you get to the level of being able to do things voluntarily for free, getting some other value out of it after you've gotten to the point where they're sustainable by profit. When you're talking about Wikipedia, being a nonprofit, I work for a nonprofit, right? And we are a growing nonprofit. Now, the goal is that I think this is another thing that a lot of people don't understand until they've actually been in the nonprofit space. We're also a nonprofit who doesn't take money from the government. So, a lot of people think nonprofits can only exist with government funding and things like that. That's not true. But 2, the way that nonprofits work, right, is you create a year budget, and by the end of the year, you want to have taken in as much money as you've spent. But when you spend that money, it doesn't mean you're spending it 100% on whatever your job, your task is. Let's say it's like an orphanage. You're not spending it 100% on hosting orphans. You're obviously paying your staff and things like that. So every year, you're also incorporating things into your budget, like new hired positions or pay raises for your staff, or maybe a new office building. So your budget grows, and then your income, if you're doing a good job, grows to match that budget, and then your spending matches your income. So yes, on the one hand, in a perfect world for the nonprofit, they are spending as much as they are making. That doesn't mean it's not growing. That doesn't mean there's not profit. It just means that the profit has been accounted for and has been dedicated. So you're not left with a surplus of unaccounted money. For a nonprofit, that's you. In order to be considered a nonprofit, you have to stay within a certain percentage of your budget in terms of overhead. Because if for 5 years in a row you get like 50% more income than you've spent, then you disqualify yourself. But the idea isn't that you're not getting more money in the years past. It's not like you're like, all right, I'm a nonprofit with $100,000 in budget every year, and that's it. And then for the rest of the time, that's all I'm. Yep. After year 2, you're like, I'm going to increase my budget to 120, then 140. But the point is you're spending those. So all that being said, Wikipedia does have a profit motive to host all these things, and that's why they ask for donations every time. So yes, contributors do voluntarily add things to that, but that's only after that first threshold of profit has been met, and the value that people find in contributing, it's worth it to the cost. When you're talking about volunteer firefighters too, it's like, they probably have some other sorts of income. My great uncle was retired and he was on the volunteer firefighter, watch in his area because he lived in, I always forget the name, but some sort of like coastal and somewhat remote area of Washington. And so it's like there isn't a lot of like, metropolitan area. There's not a fire station out there. So it's like he's in his house. That's a really nice house. He's retired. So yeah, of course he's going to do that because to him, it is worth sacrificing some of his free time for protecting his house. That in and of itself is a profit in a sense. The reassurance of safety is more valuable than the time he's dedicating to it. And that's the power of collectivism and voluntary exchange, because you don't have to specifically voluntarily exchange for money. It can be a voluntary exchange for time. That's the beauty of free markets.
Yeah, and I think if you substitute profit with am I creating or getting out of this more than I'm putting in, because that's what anyone ever wants to do, right? It is the worst feeling in the world to expend, even if it's for charitable cause, to expend a ton of effort on something and then to see that not convert into actual results. It's disappointing, it's discouraging, and it burns people out.
I mean, if anyone's spent more time on a tech issue, like your computer webcam won't work, and you spend like 8 hours, and then you find it was a simple like driver update or something. That's the feeling.
Yes, yeah. It sounds like you're speaking from experience on that one.
Maybe, I don't know.
But I want to give this example. Like people, like let's just say we're going to start a nonprofit with a cow, and the goal was to give away milk, right?
Yes,
like,
the cow is back.
The cow and milk, yeah. It's like, okay, like, yeah, sure, I'm going to give away as much milk as I can, but at some point, my cow is going to die, and in order for my nonprofit to continue on, I'll have needed to at least gathered enough resources from donations or from charging, like maybe I charge 5 to 10% above what I would normally, what the cost of the milk is when I give it away. So that way I have enough to buy another cow, right? So I can continue offering milk at cost to people. There's only two things that can occur. There's two states of existence for a business or nonprofit or any organization. You are either growing or you are shrinking, because if you are maintaining the same amount, you are going to shrink next year, right? That's just how it works, because things have to expand or else they shrink. And I think like the cow example, right? If you don't have a little bit more at the end of the year, you're gonna have no milk, right? And having a little bit more means you get to stay the same. And maybe like you're saying, like a lot of nonprofits, they take in a bunch and they want to expand to give away more of what they're doing, right? A nonprofit just means that the excess dollars that exist at the end of the year are not distributed to shareholders, right? It just means it's spent on specifically business activities and the different types of stuff that they do. And people don't get that, right? That it's no one wants to or needs to become an expert in nonprofit law or anything like that, but it'd be good to know it just so that when you see posts like this, or I guess you could listen to the cringe posts, right? You can debunk them.
Yeah, and to add on one little thing to your cow example, it's like this post is talking about like without profit motive, no one would be productive. And then they're showing like an example of the guy who voluntarily comes and he steams the milk, right? So like we're giving away milk from this cow and he steams the milk. And it's like, look, he's doing that. He's bringing his own steamer. He's contributing value to this for free, and he's giving people steamed milk that's flavored. Like, where's the profit motive? And the entire profit motive has to exist before so that the cow can produce the milk for him.
Yes.
So, it's one of those things where regardless of if someone's voluntarily giving up time and sacrificing, because that, you're sacrificing your time to do something like that. There still are costs involved and there's still profit involved. The question is just like how much of that voluntary activity can exist without a profit, and the answer is ultimately none. You have to have a base of something being produced, all the way back to if you don't have food being prepared so that you can eat, you can't give anything for free because you are starving and die. And
Yes.
it sounds like hyperbole, but if you take all the steps back in the economy, because we're so well off and so developed thanks to capitalism and free exchange and specialization, we're so well off. We're so far removed from the reality that we, in everyday life, of the fact that you have to have food coming out of the ground or animals reproducing to hunt. Like, you have to have these things happening and moving in order to exist on a day-to-day basis. And maybe we see a little bit of that with supply chain issues right now, but the point is that we're so well off in general, that we're so disconnected from that to say, there need to be costs involved with in order to eat sounds so exaggerated and silly, but it's true. We're just 10 million steps away from that because of how society has adapted.
Yeah, totally agree, man.
Okay, well, and with that, I think we're going to wrap up our show. So thank you so much for listening. We really appreciate it. If you're having a good time here, once again, we'd appreciate a comment, a share, a subscription, all that good stuff. Make sure to check out cringeposts.com for that repository of images for these cringe posts if you are listening on audio only. And we will continue to be making episodes through 2022. We're super excited, and we're only planning on growing, because if you're not growing, you're shrinking, right? So
There you go.
Anyway, well, take care, and we'll see you on the next one.